Throughout the world today, Africans are engaged in a conversation on what it is that we must do in this continent to make her realize her potential. When you are keen, you will find that Africans who are residents in the United States of America are asking the question, what is it that we must do to make Mother Africa great again? It is not lost on me that only last week here in Ghana, the president of Ghana received African Americans who were engaged in homecoming. They were here to rededicate themselves to the struggle to make Africa great again. And it is not only Africans in America who are asking the question. If you meet Africans in Europe, they are asking, what can we do to make Africa great? If you meet Africans in Asia and in Latin America, they are asking the same question. And Africans in the continent, whether you are talking about Africans in the west of Africa, in the south of Africa, in Central Africa, in North Africa, in East Africa, the single question that is being posed and waiting for an answer is, what will we do to make Africa a great continent again? The reason why that question remains alive and well is because history tells us that there was a time when this continent was great. Indeed, those who want to romanticize history will tell you that when the Europeans were in the cold and living in caves in Europe, Africa was great. There were empires alive and thriving in Ghana. There were empires alive and well, thriving in Mali. There were organized societies in Zimbabwe and in Eastern Africa. They will tell you that is our ancestors who built the pyramids in Egypt. One can only romanticize so far. They will also remind you that there was indeed a time when Africa was victimized through slavery, and that Africa went through that space for 400 years. They will also painfully remind you that Africa was the subject of European colonization. And historians will take you to Berlin in 1884 and 85 and remind you that the European powers in their selfish mode subdivided this continent arbitrarily into the countries that now constitute the continent of Africa. They will tell you sadly that the European powers, whether they were the Germans, they had a slice of their own of our continent. If they were the French, they had a slice of their own of our continent. Even poor Portugal at that time had a slice of our own of the continent. Even poor Belgium had a slice of our own of our continent. And even the arrogant British had a slice of our own of our continent. So that when we started struggling to regain our independence, we had been arbitrarily parceled out. And it was not lost on me that even at the beginning of this conference, one of the announcements that was being made is that there were Africans who are referred to as Francophone. In other words, there are those amongst us who, in describing them, we describe them by the language of the colonizer. Africa is the only continent that we still refer to as Francophone, Lusophone, Anglophone, and sometimes even Arabophone. It is not lost on me that even I am speaking in a language that is alien to us. I would have preferred to speak in Kiswahili, but that is the state of our continent. Very soon, we will call ourselves Chinaphone. So that when I am asked to talk about making Africa work for Africa, what can we do? We can only engage in that conversation in the context of history. What is it, we must ask, that has made Africa so attractive throughout the ages? There was a time when Europe was going through their first industrial revolution, when they were migrating from agriculture, and even before then they needed Africans themselves as a resource. So that in this Cape Coast, there is a monument to the atrocities occasioned by the Caucasians against us. Throughout this coast, you go to Elmina here, not far from here. You go to Liberia, to Sierra Leone, to Senegal, to the Gambia. You will find monuments to the atrocities committed against the Africans. Historians don't say it as loudly as they should, but over 1/2 of the population of Africa was taken out of this continent. If they did not find themselves in the sugar plantations in the Caribbean, they were working in the mines in Europe or building the underground railways in the United Kingdom or working in the cotton plantations in the United States of America. Africans built the world as beasts of burden. That is the Africa that we must talk about. And we cannot ignore that history. We don't talk about it as loudly as we should. The Jews were massacred in 1945. Only 6 million of them. But they have made sure that the world is always guilty about those atrocities. King Leopold of the Belgians killed 15 million Congolese. But we never talk about it. So when we talk about Africa and how we can make Africa work for Africa, we must remember the trauma that we must be suffering. Africa has never been left to rest. After they ended slavery, they came up with yet another project, the colonial project. And we struggled against the colonial project. Ethiopia was not colonized. The Italians tried until 1938, they failed. But Ethiopia was only one. Liberia regained her independence in 1847 when some of our brothers and sisters who had been taken to the United States were brought back. But the rest of Africa was subjugated. Portugal took her share in Mozambique, in Angola, in Sao Tome and Principe, in Guinea-Bissau, and in Cape Verde. And I can remember so very distinctly that until 1975, when I was a young high school student, Agostino Neto was fighting to liberate Angola. So was Jonas Malheiro Savimbi in 1975. I can remember so very distinctly as a young student in my lifetime, Samora Machel and Eduardo Mondlane struggling to free Mozambique. I can remember so very distinctly Amilcar Cabral struggling to liberate Guinea-Bissau. So it is not long ago. It is yesterday in historical terms. They were kicked out by force of arms, the Portuguese. Did they leave? No, they did not leave. They engaged in political and economic shape-shifting, so that if you go to Mozambique, you go to Angola, and you go to Guinea-Bissau, the Portuguese influence is still there in a surreptitious and in a subterranean manner and in a pernicious manner. And if you doubt me, you only have to listen occasionally to their accredited ambassadors in their unguarded moment. They still think that those countries are their fiefdoms, to be guided occasionally if they are out of line. But the most pernicious of the colonizers was France, pernicious to the core. I remember, courtesy of history, when in 1958, the Gaullist administration in France, having surrendered to the reality that Africans had to regain their independence, asking the colonies to vote yes or no. It is only Modibo Keita of Mali and Ahmed Sékou Touré of Guinea, and to a certain extent Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria, who said we will be free in poverty. And you remember what they did when they were leaving the French. They destroyed everything, leaving Guinea to die. They had written the obituary of Guinea. They had written the obituary of Mali. They had written the obituary of Algeria. And they ensured that their former colonies entered into a pact which is alive today, that their currency will be printed from France, and that their banks will be controlled from France. In the mind of the French, whether you are talking of Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, whether you are talking of Nicolas Sarkozy, whether you are talking of Macron, in the unguarded moment, they still think that former French colonies are merely their backyards. That is the Africa that you are asking me to talk about how she can work. And when they were done with us, you know what they created? They created an organization of former French colonies, headquartered appropriately in Paris, France. And if you thought you had seen it all with the French, then they were the gentle and sometimes arrogant British. Why arrogant? The empire over which the sun will never set, they said, but it set. They colonized Nigeria, they colonized Ghana, and people fought against them. It was a great son of this land, the Osagyefo, Kwame Nkrumah, who on the eve of independence and on the day of independence reminded Africans on the 6th day of March 1957 that the independence of Ghana meant nothing if the rest of Africa was not free. So we regained independence from the United Kingdom. They gave us constitution. They called them the Westminster Model Constitution. Remember, we are in Africa, but our constitutions, whether in Ghana or in Nigeria or in Uganda or in Malawi or in Zambia or Kenya or Tanzania, are referred to as Westminster Model Constitution. British bureaucrats sitting at the White Hall in London and giving us constitution. Go ye Africans and try it out. Africa became a laboratory for the ideas of European bureaucrats. That is the Africa that you are asking me, how does it work? An Africa for which once we had regained our independence, they created for us the Commonwealth of Independent States. And that Commonwealth is a Commonwealth of independent and equal states, they tell us. But the Queen is the head until the second coming of Christ. That Commonwealth which the United States of America, which was a former colony of the United Kingdom, cannot get into and is not a member of because she's too powerful to be superintended by a former colonizer. That is the Africa that we are grappling with. There is also another Africa, an Africa where Belgium, little Belgium, controls the Democratic Republic of Congo, controls Rwanda and Burundi. That is the Africa that we are talking about. Can she be great? Can she be made to work? Oh, the post-colonial African state was designed to fail. This is a question that sometimes we are too afraid to ask. There is also another Africa which, and recently as 1980, when I was a high school student, had not even regained our independence, Zimbabwe, called Rhodesia at that time. And then there is another Africa. Another Africa which in 1994, when I had graduated and was teaching and working, is when the Europeans recognized that they are equals in apartheid South Africa. Otherwise, in 1948, the Europeans in that country, the Boers and the British, took the view that Africans were children of a lesser God, that we were only fit to be hewers of wood and drawers of water. That is how they held until 1994. But as I speak today now, 80% of the land in South Africa is still in the hands of the whites. And they want to be compensated. They took it for free, but they want to be compensated. They had no passports and visas when they came, but they want to be compensated. They are saying the same thing in Zimbabwe. They want to be compensated. They want to be compensated in Namibia. They want to be compensated. That is the Africa that we are gathered here today to talk about. That Africa is a troubled Africa. Is an Africa which, if you permit me, I want to tell you, you paint, and some of these things are homegrown, some of them are engineered from outside, because poverty is a multi-billion-dollar industry. You know, sometimes when I listen to Kwame Nkrumah or read some of his works, I say to myself, his other human failings notwithstanding, he had the foresight of a Jewish prophet. Because as early as 1961 in Casablanca, Morocco, he told the leaders of the time that if Africa was to work, Africa had to unite. But fellow Africans and friends of goodwill, even as early as that time, Europe was beginning to divide Africa. They had their own group. They had sponsored Cote d'Ivoire's Félix Houphouët-Boigny to argue against the Osagie for Kwame Nkrumah. But Nkrumah did not stop there. He had other compatriots who thought like he did. Patrice Emery Lumumba did not go to anybody's university, but he was clear that Africa must write her own story. Julius Kambarage Nyerere, so that when Africa met on the 24th and 25th days of May 1963 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, the message was one and clear that if Africa was to work, Africa had to work as one unit. Kwame reminded the audience, let us unite today. Let us come out of Addis Ababa with one country. Let us come out of Addis Ababa with one army. Let us come out of Addis Ababa with one currency. Let us come out of Addis Ababa with a common foreign policy. Because if we don't, we will each get used to our little sovereignties. Central African Republic will become used to the little sovereignty. Rwanda, Swaziland, Burundi, and all the other countries, and it will become difficult to unite us. But who listened to Kwame on that day? While he wanted the United States of Africa, we ended up with the Organization of African Unity, a loose alliance of heads of states. But you and me know that at that time the neo-colonial project had started working. I'm saying this because you are asking me to talk about how we can make Africa work. Before we talk about how to make her work, we must understand how she is. This is a diagnostic process. We are trying to understand the maladies that afflict her, because we must understand the etiology of these maladies in order to prescribe the right medication. So that the neo-colonial project was one that was meant to ensure that we appear to be independent. As somebody once said it in a most eloquent way, Africans were given the crown, but the jewels were retained. So in 1960, Those who had started speaking about Africa and how to make Africa great were being eliminated one by one. In Congo, in 1961, barely 9 months after Congo had regained her independence, Patrice Emery Lumumba was dead. In Togo, barely 1 year after independence, Sylvanus Olympia was dead. And if they were not dead, they were removed. Here in Ghana, the Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah was removed. In Nigeria, Nnamdi Azikiwe was removed with Tafawa Balewa and the Sultan of Sokoto, Sir Ahmadu Bello. In Mali, Modibo Keita was gone. And if you go to all the countries, Amadou Ahidjo was gone. David Dacko was gone. Coup d'etats. That is the Africa that you are asking me to say, how will it work? It was never at ease. Destabilization after destabilization. That is the Africa. But the beauty of it that amidst all these Africans, whether they are in the political class or in the academy or in different sectors, even when they are engaged in activities that appear to undermine Africa, they have always been conscious of the fact that this continent needs to move in some useful direction. I remember as early as 1980, in Lagos, Nigeria, the Africans came together under the Lagos Plan of Action, and they said, we must make Africa work. The Lagos Plan of Action was meant to be an avenue of channeling African resources for Africa's benefit. Did the Lagos Plan of Action work as well as it was intended to? Not as well as it was intended to. So there have been many initiatives designed to make sure that Africa works. Some of them are homegrown, some of them are engineered from outside. Once again, begging the question, why is it always that people are prescribing for Africa what she needs to do? How many of you here will forget the Lomé Convention of 1975, signed in the neighborhood here in Lomé, Togo, African, Caribbean, and Pacific, telling us how we should cooperate with Europe as a way of immunizing ourselves from poverty and improving our lot. Is it in the best interest of Europe that we should do well? I doubt. And when the Lomé Convention had died its death, they came up with another one in 2000 called the Cotonou Convention. This belt, Lomé, Cotonou, appears to be a very favored site for signing these treaties. They signed yet another one in Cotonou to take over from the Lomé Convention. Once again, Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific, is it in their best interest that we should do well? And there is an old English saying, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And for whose benefit is the tune called? And they did not stop there. Everybody somehow is always interested in Africa and her welfare. How many of you here will not remember the structural adjustment programs in the 1980s? How many of you here will not remember the Millennium Development Goals? There were 8 when they came about. Now they have been renamed. Now they are Sustainable Development Goals, and there are 34 of them. How many of you here will not remember Africa Growth Opportunity Act? The House, the Parliament of the United States of America, sitting at the Capitol Hill in the United States of America saying we open the space for African countries, and what are they opening space for? Textile. We will now, whether it is in Lesotho, whether it is in Nigeria or Nairobi, Kenya, our women and our young men are sewing jeans and other apparels which are taken to supermarkets in the United States of America. And once they have worn them and they are tired of them, they created another export opportunity of second-hand clothing. And second-hand clothing, that is why the textile industries in Kaduna in Nigeria died. That is why textile companies in Kenya, whether it was Rivertex, whether it was Kikomi, whether it was Mountex, they all died, because Europe was now telling us what we have consumed and rejected, you Africans must now consume. And when recently the Rwandese and the Ugandans said that we were going to stop the importation of second-hand clothing, they threatened us with sanction. Africa is meant to treat us new, that which Europe and America has rejected. That is the Africa that you want me to talk about. So when we talk about this continent of Africa, there have been no shortage of attempts to help her and for her to help herself. I remember on the 6th day of March, 1997, in Accra, Ghana, the former president of Tanzania, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, speaking under the theme, the unity of Africa, said, among other things, that we have not come here to remind ourselves how important unity is. We know that African unity is significant. And he said, if Africa is to be a great continent and if Africa is to realize our potential, Africans must de-emphasize their Tanzanianness. Africans must de-emphasize their Ghanaianness, and they must emphasize their Africanness. And he went on to say, I'm not naive in appreciating that we have long been in our little corners, but I'm telling us that out there in the world, they only know us as Africans. And he reminded the audience that there are times when he has gone to Europe and his own colleagues in the leadership in certain parts of the world will ask him what is happening in Senegal while he himself is the president of Tanzania. So that is the Africa that we are talking about. So there have been many initiatives to make Africa great. How many of us will forget the new initiative for African development under NEPAD, signed in the year 2001 in Lusaka, Zambia, when Africans took the view once again that in order to grow, we must work together. There have been no shortage of initiatives to bring Africa together. And I remember in the very early days, in the 1960s and in the 1970s, the grand project as conceived by Kwame Nkrumah having failed to take off as it was designed to take off, many African countries took the view that the only way in which we could ultimately have the grand African agenda was to come up with regional developments. So we came up with the East African Community, and indeed, I can remember so very vividly, because even in Africa, there were days when Africa worked in the early days. In the early days, many African countries were recording economic growth of anything between 6 and 7%. In the early days after independence, there were areas where Africa was growing in education. In the health, the indices had improved so that infant mortality and maternal mortality indices were positive. We could see that in agriculture, Africa was beginning to feed herself. Africa was adding value to her things. I remember in Nairobi, in public schools, young school children would receive textbooks and exercise books. I remember that classes had libraries. I remember that in those early days, the public transport systems worked. I remember in those days that our agricultural products were receiving the kind of prices that they ought to receive in the world market. I remember in those early days in countries such as Zambia, the kwacha was strong because the copper was being paid for rightly. I remember in those early days in countries such as this one where cocoa, and in the neighboring Cote d'Ivoire when cocoa was being transported and you are receiving the right price. I remember in those early days diamond from Wadui in Shinyanga and diamond from Botswana and in Namibia were receiving the right price. There was a time in those early days when Africa was indeed moving in some direction. And I remember in East Africa when we had one common currency, when we had one airline, when we had one university, and things were moving. In the education sector, I remember students coming from Kenya and traveling to Fura Bay in Freetown. I remember hearing universities such as the University of Education at Winneba. I remember the University of Legon. I remember the University of Nigeria at Nsukka. I remember the University of Maiduguri, and I remember the University of Makerere in Uganda, and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and many other universities. Africa was rising, but something happened. Something happened. Something happened. There are those who think that it was externally induced. They may be right. There are those who think that our leadership was also a contributory factor, and I think they are right. So that there is a sense in which we Africans are also co-authors of our own misfortune. We are co-authors in the sense that there is, and there have been opportunities to make us great. At the beginning of the address, the Vice Chancellor rightly remarked, the professor rightly remarked that in Africa there were countries that were doing better than South Korea. Kenya was doing better than South Korea. Kenya had a higher GDP than China. Ghana, the same. Tanzania, the same. Then somehow the Koreans went and left us. The Chinese during our lifetime have left us. The Singaporeans have left us. The Malaysians have left us. The Brazilians have left us. The Vietnamese after the war in 1975 have left us. Who is it? What is it that holds us back? What is it? Is it us? Is it some power? Are we children of a lesser God? What is it that holds us back? Why is it that Africa does not work? Why is it that I'm speaking to you now? Even what we call peace in many African countries is not peace, it's just silence. I've lamented for too long. Now I want to talk about what it is that we can do. But before I do that, let us look at our continent, at this continent called Africa. Our combined GDP, the 54 officially recognized countries, that is assuming that you don't ask the Moroccans about Sahrawi. Our GDP last year combined, the 54 of us, combined, all of us, 1.4 billion of us, our goods and services put together, is no more than 2 trillion United States dollars, and I'm being generous about this. And to give you a perspective, the state of California in the United States of America, with a population of slightly under 39 million, has a GDP last year of 3 trillion United States dollars. To give you a perspective, and my good friend, the Honorable Minister from Burundi is here, their GDP last year was no more than 2.3 billion United States dollars. That is exactly the same amount that the state of New York in New York collects in one day. In one day. That is the continent that we are talking about, my mother Africa. How are we going to make her work? I want you to look at her. Look at her in the Gambia. What does she produce? Groundnuts. That is assuming that the Chinese will not come out with plastic groundnuts soon. And I'm saying this to tell us we are relying on goods which can be taken out of the market. And tourism. How many people visit the Gambia in the name of tourism? If they are more than 1 million, then we celebrate and we bring out dancers. Meanwhile, the bazaar market in Istanbul receives 99 million visitors every year. What tourism are we talking about? Let us go to Senegal. What is she producing? How can we make her work? How can we make Mauritania work? How can we make Mali work? How can we make Chad work when almost 70% of it has dried out in the last few decades? Then you wonder why we have Boko Haram, why there are recruits for Boko Haram and ISIS and Daesh. Go to Sudan and South Sudan, countries that are endowed with natural resources. Go to the Democratic Republic of Congo, a paradox and an irony at once, the richest country on earth in terms of natural resources. But who will allow Congo to be at ease? Who will allow her? Because in her state of confusion, she is a jungle from which you can hunt without consequence. So when one rebel group dies, another one is resuscitated. I know of no African country that makes weapons except South Africa. The others just make bullets. The Kenyans will make bullets. The Ugandans will make bullets, but they have no gun to use them, and they import the guns. And yet the conflicts that are alive and well in Africa are legion, as the Central African Republic. They are conflicts which are no longer covered in the newspapers or in the media of the forgotten conflicts of Africa. Burkina Faso. And yet the African Union says that by the year 2020, the guns will be silent in Africa. 2020 is 28 days away from today. The guns will not be silent. And I'm saying this because to make Africa work, the guns must be silent. Because if the guns are not silent, our farmers will not grow crops. If the guns are not silent, our women will not go to the markets. If the guns are not silent, our resources will not be channeled in the right direction. The guns must be silent. We want to make Africa work. Will she work? Can she work? Yes, she can. But what are the fundamentals that must make Africa work? Let me remind you, Africa remains attractive. Why is Africa so attractive? Throughout the ages, it has always been attractive. It was attractive to the Portuguese and the Spaniards, but I'm not going to say that. It was attractive to the Arabs, but I'm not going to say that. It was attractive to the Jews, but I will not say that. What I'm going to say that is attractive again, it is so attractive that every 2 years the Japanese call our leaders to Japan. That is how attractive Africa is. They call them to Japan in order to discuss how Japan is going to work with Africa for the benefit of Africa. I do not believe it. It must be for the benefit of Japan. It is so attractive that the Chinese leaders call Africans to Beijing every year. The 54 of them, they call them to Beijing. And they say this is how China is going to work for the benefit of Africa. I refuse to believe them. It must be that there is something that is being done for the benefit of Beijing. Because if I was Chinese, I would do that which is in my best interest, not in the best interest of Africans. It is so attractive that the Russians called our leaders only a few months ago in Sochi. And when they invite you to the best places. It is so interesting, so that the Russians can work with Africa for the benefit of Africa. That is how attractive Africa is. It is so attractive that the Germans also invited our leaders to Berlin. It is so attractive that even the Arabs are inviting them to Doha, and that is how attractive it is. Have you ever heard the Latin Americans being invited? No, I did not hear. Have you ever heard the Arabs being invited? No. It is only Africans who are invited. That is how attractive Africa is. Is it a bad thing? Depending on what you think. We can use it to our own advantage, or we can allow them to use it to their advantage.